Welcome everyone to today's panel discussion titled The Role of Data in Gen AI. Today we have an excellent panel who will discuss how data drives the development of generative AI and its impact across different sectors. Our panel will cover some key topics, including data collection, pre-processing, the challenges of ensuring fairness and privacy. We hope this discussion provides valuable insights. If you have questions along the way, please place them in today's chat, the Zoom chat here. And without further ado, I will pass things over to today's moderator, Annie.
Thank you, Carly. Hello, everyone. My name is Anni Lai, the chair of Generative AI Commons. I host this webinar on behalf of the Generative AI Commons every quarter. This is our second webinar. Thank you for dialing in. Today's webinar topic is the role of data in generative AI. As you know that we are in the era that generative AI is transforming industries, creativity, and decision-making in ways that we could not have imagined just a couple of years ago. At the heart of these breakthroughs is one crucial element: data. Data powers the models, shapes the outcomes, and drives the innovation we see in AI today. But it also brings with it a set of challenges around quality, diversity, bias, privacy, and governance. How we handle and leverage data will ultimately determine the future trajectory of generative AI, from ensuring fairness to unlocking its full potential across different sectors. Today, we're very fortunate to have a distinguished panel of experts who will shed light on these vital issues and offering their insights on the intersection of data and AI. Our panelists brings a wealth of knowledge from diverse fields, including AI development, data governance, research, and policy. Please join me in welcoming our panelists as we dive into this exciting and critical conversation. Welcome, panelists. Please briefly introduce yourself and explain your role in Gen AI. Who would like to start? Lisa?
I can start first just because I noticed the order of the titles, so I just figured we'd go off that. Hi, everybody. My name is Denny Lee. I'm a principal developer advocate here at Databricks. I work with Gen AI quite a bit because many are both our customers and our community members really want to dive in and figure out how to make best use of Gen AI, but doing so in a very with governance in mind, structures in mind, right from the get-go. So I work a lot with both the community members and also with customers on that. So hopefully, this particular conversation will be helpful for everybody.
Next, Lisa, maybe?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I am the product manager at Datastrato. We are maintainers of an open source and multi-cloud data catalog called Apache Gravitino. We're still an incubating project. And I think a lot of what my role is previously I was a data engineer. And as somebody who's seen a lot of crap architecture as a data engineer, with this new era of generative AI applications, we're having to really rethink how we view data infrastructure and how we actually view preparing data for consuming for different types of teams and organizations. And I think that is such a messy thing right now that we're in the middle of kind of figuring out as a field. And I'm really excited to be part of that conversation.
Thank you, Lisa. Nick, you're next.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Nick Schifano. I am the founder of fastcatalog.ai, a new venture started just a few months ago. And so our mission is to simplify the management of open source AI models and public data to build AI systems. For instance, we make it easy to generate AI transparency reports, bills of materials, or to detect things like non-commercial use restrictions in the tree of dependency of an AI model. Before that, I was at Microsoft Legal. I was leading the governance of public data for the development of AI systems on the legal side. And so the issue there really took off in 2020, and then we launched a central function to handle the cases. So after thousands of cases and reviews, I noticed how painful and slow it was to navigate the maze of public AI assets, models, or data sources. And so I decided to help the industry solve that problem and launch that venture. I look forward to the conversation today and meeting all of you.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, great. Let's just get started. So number one question, some people say data is the code in AI. So quality of data matters a lot in AI training. Panelists, from your experience, what do you consider the key characteristics of high quality data sets for model training, and how can organizations ensure that they meet these standards? Who would like to tackle this question first? Lisa? Okay.
I can go first, I guess. Yeah, I think this is a really important question that people are talking about right now. And I think we've all seen like these sort of checklists for what is technically a high quality data set. And I think there's some really underrated characteristics here. For me, a high quality data set should be reproducible. If it's not a reproducible high quality data set, it's probably not high quality. And I think to keep a high quality data set high quality, it should be observed. And so a high quality data set will change over time. It will become low quality naturally if you never take care of it. And so you should really be checking like how it's doing in production and observing, you know, its distribution, its quality, and monitoring these things. I think we kind of miss that step a lot. And it should have a lot of metadata because it should obviously have a lot of context around it. And within the ecosystem, you should understand what this data is actually capturing. And it's really important for consistency. And I think those things are really underrated characteristics, but I think weirdly enough, probably the most is probably patience. We get a lot of requests to have like this high quality data set to train this model for the stakeholder to transform their organization without necessarily the right setup for it and without understanding that these things take time. And there's this huge disparity right now between data engineers and ML engineers in terms of what data is actually available, what's in a good quality, like what's in good quality right now, and what necessarily needs time to build tooling around. And until we kind of figure out what that difference is between like this pipe dream data that we have like mustered up in R&D and then working backwards painfully to kind of capture what that might be, we probably won't have as many high quality data sets as we have. And you might not necessarily be capturing what you want to capture, and it might not necessarily be relevant unless you get like the right people in those conversations.
I see.
And exactly adding to Lisa's point here, right? When you look at the concept of high quality data sets, and by the way, you'll notice that there's actually a sort of a theme for today where basically, you know, Lisa's from Gravitino, right? Nick's from Fast Catalog, and I'm from Databricks, and of course, Unicatalog, right? So I got to, you know, do my little dev thing there, right? But the key aspect is this idea of how do you have some form of governance to ensure that the data you have, you know where its source is from. You know that it's clean. You know that somebody processed this data in a particular way. Because, you know, when you look at any of these, the idea of any sample sets, when they say, oh, hey, you know, just do these 5 steps and then you've got your perfect GenAI workload, right? And what usually happens is this wonderfully clean data set right from the get-go. Then you do your thing, right, in order to be able to fine-tune, train, whatever it is that you're doing. And then boom, you ragify it, you build a complex AI system, don't really care. But the point is now you've got this wonderful chatbot or wonderful system that works great, right? People forget that there's this whole thing about, well, did the data that went in actually even make sense in the first place? So are the results you're getting actually even worthwhile? And is there any form of lineage that explains to you what your data source is and what you did to that data, right? And so piggybacking exactly what Lisa's talking about, right? The reality is high quality data sets actually have to have some form of governance and structure to it in the first place. It actually has to have this concept of, I know where it came from. I know what happened to it. I have a lineage of who is dependent on what and how I join X, Y, Z data sets together, right? And unless you're doing these things, the reality is it's cool if you're able to start off with that, you know, 30 row CSV file that has that data. That's great. Don't get me wrong. I've done with smaller amounts of data, so it's okay, right? But in reality, as we actually trying to leverage and make use of GenAI, you're going to need to put multiple data sets together. And when that happens, unless you actually understand what you're doing with that data, basically it's the old garbage in, garbage out when you're talking about building these type of models.
Yeah. So that leads to my next question. So what are the challenges in collecting and pre-processing these data for GenAI? And what are the best practices that you could share with us to overcome these challenges? Lisa?
Sure. I don't want to lead every single question, so I know that Nick's going to follow me after
That's
this
right.
one. Yeah. So I think that probably the biggest challenge that we have is that traditionally ETL and data pipelines have been built for relational stores. That's been like we have been perfecting that for decades. And then overnight, we have had this huge amount of unstructured data that we're not only serving in different ways, but we're consuming in different ways as well. Like even when we think about simple machine learning, we took unstructured data and then we made it structured through the process of ETL and transformations. And now we're being told, okay, just serve up this unstructured data, but we're asking you to do it in real time and to join across many different types of data as well, which is a really tough beast. And not only that, but it's extremely costly. Like it is so expensive to do and even just to store. And so when we think about these challenges, we're thinking about stratification across all these different clouds and formats and the access control around that, which is like, again, the governance piece that Denny is talking about. And it's really tough to kind of figure out how to actually do that in a streamlined way. And so I think instead of like kind of figuring out how we can build more pipelines for this, how can we actually change the infrastructural model so that we can process and actually collect this data in a way that's more platform friendly? And I think the catalog is kind of the backbone of that. And that's kind of our vision and probably Unity Catalog's vision for that as well, in terms of how that's actually going to look in the future. So yeah, I think that the challenge is really infrastructural, and it's really hard because the more that you have here in terms of these moving pieces and technologies, the more complexity is added and the more mess and noise is there, and it becomes harder and harder to govern.
Anyone else?
Yeah, Annie, just a few thoughts perhaps on this question. I think one of the key challenges when handling the issue of data in the context of generative AI, the collection, the preprocessing, one of the things I've noticed is just to handle the scale with a set of assets which are very different one from the other. I think it's going to be easy to come up with rules for one type of assets or maybe two or three. However, and just to give a few examples, so from the generative AI systems that I've seen, or language models, you often have assets like public data that are used, and then some companies want to use private data as well. Sometimes they take the public data and they process it in a particular way, and then they feel like it's kind of their own thing now, even though it was sourced from public sources. And you have typically, I would say, for an AI system between 10 or 50 data sources that are used, but they are all very different. They can be public, they can be private, they can have these different issues in terms of, is there public data? Do I have customer data in there? So you're dealing with extremely different assets in many different ways, and you have to come up with kind of a unified set of rules that are going to be able to manage all these things, because they're all going to end up to train the same system. And your public data is going to be under very different rules than your customer data, which is typically encumbered by your privacy practices, your maybe regulator commitment, regulations, if you're in specific industries. So yeah, I would say handling the scale with very diverse assets, very different characteristics is certainly one of the key challenges, and do that in an effective way.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so it's a good point that a lot of models actually training data from various sources. So we know the diversity of data for GenAI model training is very important. So what do you think the impact of diversity of data can make in the areas of performance, generalizability of GenAI models? Would anybody like to comment on that?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I would start off with, right, when you talk about the diversity of data, right, let's go backwards a little bit when you talk about, and this is good old-fashioned machine learning that we're talking about these days, right, which is that, how they talk about you can overfit your model, right? So the whole premise is that, I could always build a really good machine learning model that will predict at 100% based off of the training data that I have, right? The problem, of course, is I've overfitted to that data so that when I introduce new data, then the predictions are all over the place, right? So the whole goal of building an ML model is to actually have it more generalized, not too generalized. This is the old, a little bit of this, a little of that, but you might try to quite get it right? And so the context is that, well, how do you achieve that goal? And a lot of people, of course, they say, oh, that's because of the hyperparameters or the type of training you're using. And then when there's GenAI, it's like, oh, because I'm using curriculum learning or I'm using 1000 shot or whatever else, right? And don't get me wrong, I'm not disputing there are these various techniques that we want to do to help with that process. That absolutely is correct. But the usually overlooked aspect of this is number one, the data, right? As in, well, if you have the exact same set of data and it's coming from the exact same source, then yeah, guess what? Your model's very, very precise. Now, don't get me wrong, sometimes that's actually really helpful. I've got like an HR policy book that's for this one particular company. That's actually really good because then I can, just as long as I can cite the policy book, my LM actually is going to be quite precise and not likely to hallucinate, right? So that's a good thing, actually. But in general, even with this idea of building an LM, even for a specific company, the reality is that you need to take in other data sources, whether those data sources are within the company itself or even better, taking external data sources so you can benchmark yourself against other systems, whatever they may be. Well, that diversity, of course, helps out, right? Because then you're no longer overfitting for your scenario. You can actually take into account how the rest of the world works, per se, right? And ultimately, that's what the end goal is, right? Because even if you're trying to build these models that are designed specifically for your specific environment, it doesn't mean there aren't other data sources that can actually help your specific environment, whether that's internal to the company or external. And then that's implied by that diversity aspect, which is that, okay, so then you do actually need a diversity of data sources to actually give yourself better performing models, right? The one small caveat I would always add is that, of course, the more data you add, the more dirty this information can be. And then, of course, that could impact the performance. And of course, there's always a performance of latency, which I haven't even alluded to yet. And of course, the problem with that is that it's really depending on how you build up the model in the first place. That goes back to now the 1000 shot, which model you're using, what foundational model you're using. And that, admittedly enough, data can impact that, obviously, but now this goes into more that domain of the researchy domains. Like, okay, I'm going to have to change my model from a dense model to a sparse model. I'm going to have to do MOE or whatever else. And so you always have to, again, Susan on this, a little bit of that. So
yeah, you need to have a balance there. Anyone else?
I can weigh in on this as well. I think Denny did this amazing job at going over the impact of diversity in terms of training the model. And I think that was, I'm not going to tag onto that, but that was an amazing answer. And I loved it. I think for me, when I think about the diversity of data, there's also this broader component where each year when I look at that like ML and AI data landscape, like there's 1,000 more tools that get added onto it. And so when we consider the diversity of data, we can also consider like not just the modalities of the different data that we see, but like the multiple cloud providers that we have, all of these different types of data from like, streaming data to other types of batch ingestion that we might have, these images, like there's just so much that's out there and that we want to collect it all. We've gotten so greedy over time. And then we're having to look at all these shiny new data formats and make it work with our legacy and proprietary data formats as well. And so this diversity is like so far in terms of its like horizontal reach, but also its vertical reach as well, and in terms of how we think about it. And so each time I think about the more diverse data that's out there, I think about all the intermediary tools that come in between that and how we have to build so many new things just to get it to converge and make it servable. And with each tool that kind of gets put in here with each new data source, you're going to have like this performance impact. You're going to have the scalability impact because there's just so much weight there, right? And when you're trying to do it at scale, there's a huge performance hit as well. And so, especially when we're trying to do things in real time, right? We're trying to personalize in real time. We're trying to integrate and do like fusion in real time. And so it becomes so extremely like weighty, right? And it slows down these applications when we really want to like prioritize speed, and it makes it extremely costly. And so I think that what we're going to see more of and what we've seen in the past is like this movement towards standards again. Like we've had Hadoop to try and do this across different stores. We've had obviously Apache Spark as well to do this from a processing perspective. All of these are trying to hit the same sort of performance bottleneck from different parts of the stack. And now, of course, Apache Iceberg is now so widely adopted. And we're seeing that open table format trying to kind of converge across all of this. And I think the next one is like, what is the new catalog standard that will be adopted as a part of this as well? And what is the new governance framework that people will adopt as their standard? And the more diverse things become, I think it hits this threshold where people then go, okay, I'm so sick of everything. Can we just have a standard? And then we're like, this is a cycle that's been happening more and more often. And then once we hit that standard, things are kind of performing again. And so that's kind of the weird thing that I see.
Okay. So we talked a lot about the quality of data. How about quantity of data? It is also important to know, when it comes to Gen AI, we need to have a vast amount of data, right? And how can organizations balance the need for vast amount of data with the ethical consideration and privacy concerns of the data subjects? Who would like to tackle that question?
I can. I don't know, Danny. I can go.
Nick, please go for it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So going back, taking back a step, I think companies often have they have to deal with privacy regulations around the world, GDPR in Europe, privacy regulations, more perfect verticals in the US. And so very often all companies have implemented some sort of privacy compliance practices and commitments in response to these regulations. And these don't really go away with AI. These privacy controls often evolve around the storage of the data, the processing of the data, who can do what, with what purpose, have you disclosed these things to the data subjects? What are the data subjects' rights about their data that is under your purview? Like, how do you handle that? In a way, AI makes it a lot harder to ensure that, let's say, the training data stays under these practices and commitments. Data leaks can become a real issue because maybe you're taking your private data, you're creating it in some way, maybe you're reviewing the PII in it, and you're putting it in a place so you can do the training. There are real risks associated with that. So how do you handle that? I think companies have to figure out whether they need to adjust their existing privacy policies to handle that. I think public data is becoming a new consideration, and maybe there is a need to revisit these policies to see whether the PII in public data is actually handled. That's not necessarily a super common concern until now, and some would take the view that it has to. And then there will be probably, and maybe Danny can talk more about that, but the need to decide how far do you want to go in the scrubbing of personal data, PII, in this public data. I mean, when you have a data set of 1,000 terabytes, like, do you need to curate every instance of PII? Do you need to go and check for social security numbers, addresses, like images? Like, how do you go? How do you do it? You can really boil the ocean. How do you ensure your generative AI system doesn't output personal data if it's in the training data? I mean, that's a real a concern. And so you have to, I think, be smart about it and kind of decide how much risk you want to take given the context and given how these systems would be used. Yeah, certainly a huge challenge. And I think the common knowledge is that more data is better to train a better system for the reasons that Danny explains earlier. And so going back to my point around scale, I think our management systems will have to scale along with it. And that's it's a lot of work ahead.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, add to Nick's point. I mean, exactly what Nick called out. There's a lot of work. And the reality is we barely do a good enough job 30 years ago when we had a lot less data, when we could lock everything into some proprietary relational database where each of us had these 200-page documents that would explain how to do governance. And then we had entire legal teams that would deploy said 200-page documents for each business, right? The reality is we are going much, much, much faster there, right? So start off exactly what Nick called out. There's the public data sets, like Common Crawl, for example, using that's just one example, right? The reality is a lot of these systems are actually starting to tighten up. There's a lot of lawsuits. Don't worry, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to get into that. But the point is that there are a lot of lawsuits between the various GenAI companies with news organizations, and they're all now running deals, right? To basically, so that way you can use said news articles from various organizations, right? It's going to work itself out because that's how the legal system works. And then we're really glad the GDPR push that the European Union has been pushing for such a long time allows us a framework for these type of discussions. So for anybody that's in general want to work in this space, the overall advice is understanding there's a lot of people trying to achieve these same goals, whether it is through a vendor technology or it is to open source organizations. The key question, the key context is one right or one wrong. They're all right and they're all wrong at the exact same time. No, what it really is about working with them and trying to publicly explain what you're trying to do. So that way everybody understands that there's actually an intention to secure the data, to privatize the data, right? And just to overemphasize the point, there's still the confusion between the security of data and the privacy of data, right? As a general rule. The idea of securing data is simple, like as in person X, person Y is authorized to access that data. But just because somebody's is provided the right to access the data, remember, when it comes to this space, even before GenAI, I'm able to join that with multiple external data sources. And when I can do that, I can by accident reveal the privacy of the individuals of that data. We've actually known this for a while. Latanya Sweeney, back in 1990, she went ahead and introduced the concept of k-anonymity. And the whole premise was that she asked 3 questions and was then able to identify the medical records of then Governor William Weld of Massachusetts, right? So we could do that back in 1990. Think about what we can do now, right? That's the only reason I pull up that particular little piece of trivia, right? So the reality is, this is again why catalogs are so important. This is exactly to Lisa's point about why open standards eventually are going to be so important, because irrelevant of which catalog, again, we've got 3 right here, right? Right. Irrelevant of which one you, we're going to all eventually follow the same set of standards. Why? Because that's going to be most useful for everybody. And then because we have this concept, because of this idea of authorization, authentication, because the idea that we're publicly explaining what we're trying to do, obviously with lawyers' backings, then what you end up having is this ability to go ahead and ensure that you have some form of both security and privacy against that data, right? So that way you can actually explain why you've done these things. It'll take some time, just like Nick called out, but we're going to get there, just because in the end, the financial requirements require us to do this. Simple as that.
Awesome. So thank you, Danny. So we're earlier, I think Lisa said we're so hungry for data. I mean, we need more and more data, but human-made data is not enough. So there's a trend of using synthetic data to supplement real-world data sets for AI training. What are the implications of using synthetic data for Gen AI? Will we get to a point that AI will suffer from dementia due to using too much synthetic data? Who would like to tackle that one?
Well, I can say a few words just to break the ice.
Sure.
Yeah. So I'm kind of going to be, a little bit biased by my own mindset. I think the view is, so exactly what you said. We need more data. Synthetic data can help, get more tokens. It can also help balance out. Maybe if you have a skewed distribution in the real world data, maybe with synthetic data, you can make your distribution with the shape you like, and then you can fill the blanks in a way. Also, sometimes synthetic data is viewed as a way to bypass regulatory issues around real world data. So if you have, billions of images of real people, hey, let's just generate images of people and let's train, presence detection models based on the synthetic data rather than the real world data because it's not real people. And so, hey, I'm bypassing stuff, except that when you start generating billions of images, you're going to end up looking like someone who exists. I think these issues, so synthetic data is helpful, in all these ways. It still requires to, handle a few things right. Like you still need to track, I believe, the origin of the underlying content. So you're going to build your pipeline of data. And, at some point, you're going to feed into the training system synthetic data rather than live data, where the synthetic data is going to come from somewhere. And I think you still need to track that because that's, part of your governance system. You want to be able to remember where is the data coming from. And for instance, there may be restrictions or issues with the underlying data that was used to generate the synthetic data. There may be restrictions on the tool, like the generative models that was used to generate your synthetic data. For, like Llama is well known for making its restrictions evolve in terms of, using Llama to generate training data sets. Same for OpenAI. They have kind of language around, using OpenAI to generate training data sets. So something to keep in mind for sure. And then because it's synthetic, you may have to deal with additional disclosure obligations because you're using synthetic data. So I think it's just yet another thing to consider. So you have another tool in the toolbox that comes with its own set of issues to handle, and you're going to commingle all these assets together, and they're all going to be special in their own way. And so when you try, again, going back to scale, when you try to build a system at scale, you need to be sufficiently agile to handle these special cases.
Yeah, I think Nick covered it really well. I mean, let me almost oversimplify it back to even our machine learning days, right? Everybody was talking about, variational autoencoders. They're talking about GANs to basically generate synthetic data sets, right? And whether you're using the quote unquote old school, by the way, I apologize for doing that because they're not that old, but in the AI world, it's older than 3 years. So yeah, that's old, right? So the reality is it's a great synthetic data generation is a great tool in the toolbox, just like Nick called out. But just like also Nick called out, the reality is you still need to be able to explain what is the original data source, the basis by which you use said synthetic the synthetic data set toolkits. You have to explain how did you generate said data. At some point, you do it at scale, exactly as was called out. You're going to be mimicking reality. So you then need to actually be able to prove, have some form of lineage to explain, no, these were the hyperparameters we used, these were the techniques we used, these were the mechanisms we used. So we, in fact, did not we did not take somebody's picture using the image scenario. We actually generated, and here was the original source, right? You have to be able to do that. And so it's not a solution to everything, but it is a great tool to have, and I highly advise people to do that because it is a way to then, for sake of argument, generate data in a way where you don't even have to have the original source. You can have distributions of that source, so that way you can go ahead and actually train your model in a safer way because the synthetic data is not even based on a real data set. But that doesn't change the fact that you need to be able to explain how did you get there in the first place.
Thank you. Thank you, Denny. So we are over 36 minutes into the hour. I'd like to open up the floor for the audience to ask questions. Any question? If you have any question, please put it in the chat. I got a question from Leslie. Leslie asks, is there a version management in the model building that allows for clean removal of data? What about after the foundational model is released? Anybody who would like to answer that one?
I can probably tackle that. So, right, when you talk about version management for models, typically, as a general rule, it's the version management of the model itself in terms of what hyperparameters, what techniques, what algorithms were used. So I'd like to differentiate between the data from the model. And so when you typically talk about version management for a model, it's actually that aspect, like for example, oversimplification, the hyperparameters themselves. Now, that doesn't mean you don't want to be able to know what data was assigned to it, but that's typically why we talk about forms of things like data lineage. Were the sources of data that were placed into said model? And then if you build a model management system good enough, you're actually able to tie the version, let's just say it's a table, the version of the table that you have with the version of the model you have. So you know exactly which version of the data set that you're using, which version of the model you're using in order to understand what did you train on. The problem with this idea of removal of data, right, is that if you take the current litigation, current aspect, what you actually have to do is you actually have to know what the exact data set is, and then you have to then remove it from the source and retrain the whole thing. Okay, that's actually what you would have to do. Now, there are various research techniques about saying, can you then recreate, for example, the model without the data set, but actually apply it directly to the model and quote unquote remove it, right? And there's various techniques that are trying that. None that would probably follow scrutiny right now from a legality perspective, but in terms of is it a possibility, is it exciting? Absolutely. But as a general rule, right now, the context is like, no, you just rebuild the model from scratch. So in other words, if you're saying for sake of argument, like I've got a Llama 3 model, right? So 3.1, sorry, got to be current. Then you go ahead and you happen to know that it's using this particular data source that you want removed from this. Right. You'd have to go back and say, hey, Meta, can you go rebuild it? Obviously, that's not a scenario you want to go do. So in the end, if you're going to be using models where you don't have control like that, you actually need to typically build like a compound AI system that's in place, which says, okay, look, I know that I don't want to use this data set, so I'm actually going to tell the model, you're not supposed to use this information in my prompt in order to be able to query it, or more likely, I need to use this source in my prompt in order to be able to go ahead and actually calculate its answer, basically, right? In the end, it's just math that these models are doing, probability of the next word, probability of the next phrase, right? So that's what you ultimately would need to do. And so over time, I do see that we are based on the new research techniques that are employed. It may be plausible that we could sort of almost like remove it by addition. In essence, that's what you're doing, but we're not quite there yet. If you want to use almost an old school, okay, not that old, data engineering technique, it's like the idea of a deletion vector. Like you basically add a deletion vector to remove data from like an iceberg or delta table, using that as an example. You can absolutely do the deletion by addition. So over time, I'm seeing that if I was to predict, yes, I think we're going to get there, but we're certainly not there yet. The research isn't allowing us to do that quite yet. Of course, next week this video is watching, of course, it'll be solved. So you never know.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I can weigh in on this as well, but Denny covered so much ground, and I'm so thankful because I don't have to repeat much of what he said. So thank you. And yeah, I think in a lot of ways, the core problem here is trying to be tackled almost like preemptively instead of post. And I think Denny was kind of getting at this a little bit too, where instead of necessarily deleting the data, maybe you can have masking and tagging in a way where within your actual access layer, and we kind of do this with the role-based access, your query engine will only be able to access the data that it's meant to. And if you're training on anonymized or data that's really secure, what a lot of security teams do is that they then train on like encrypted data or some sort of data where you're not exposed in any sort of way. And I think the governance there and the auditability is much cleaner in that aspect, instead of deleting and say, what do you mean? We never took a look at this data and we can't find it anymore. And we need to then recreate this experiment because the performance results were actually pretty good, but now we can't because everything's gone. And I think that just is going to end up in so many different issues. And it's kind of based on this idea that data governance and access control there is also AI governance and access control as well. And those two systems should be the same and they should be integrated together. And ideally, they should be the same tool for you to be able to manage that data lifecycle. And I think that data lifecycle management is something that data engineers have figured out. And I love this idea that as machine learning engineers, we're catching up to this idea of, hey, we should be managing the lifecycle of this data, but why don't we integrate the tools that data engineers have also been using to make it more usable as well? So there's a tooling congregation, and I hate that because that's totally what's been happening, but in the field in general. And I think that Databricks and obviously our company Datastrato is trying to bridge these two worlds together, hopefully. So that's kind of my additional comments on that.
No, great. So follow-on question from Leslie. She asked, she loved the idea, and she asked masking and tagging. Are they any open source models doing that, masking and tagging?
So this is not necessarily done on the model side, but it's done on the data infrastructure side. So Gravitino does this and has abilities to tag and do some sort of masking on the model so that when, or not on the model, but on the data, so that when the model comes in, depending on which query engine you're using, it's kind of done already for you. If you're this one person team, then a platform that offers this baked in might be easier for you instead of trying to set it up.
Yeah, perhaps just a very quick comment. I think the Denny's and Lisa's comments were really hit the nail on the head. One other issue that I've seen is, Leslie, I think we're talking about the scenario where it was like, despite all the good work that has happened up front on the governance, you still want to get rid of like one data set that is problematic for some reason. And so what I've seen very often is the next question is, where have we used this data set in all the AI systems that we have built? And so if you're like a small team of like 10, you kind of go and ask 10 people and, you eventually get an answer. If you are a large company, like forget it. And so I think that's where, systems like Catalog become really important because you want to be able to track, to have an inventory of where you use stuff so that when an issue comes up on stuff, then you are able to, not spend months and scramble and identify all the places where that may be relevant. And typically that happens where you kind of have a, pressing issue to know, like you are in litigation or a regulator has asked, and you don't want that issue becoming top of mind for the execs. So it's usually a better idea to, as Lisa pointed out, do the work up front, put the mechanisms in place. So it's just a report that you run to know where the data set is in the lineage of your system.
Yeah.
Just to add to the point, really short call out, but to exactly Lisa Nick's point, security by default means you actually need to do the work up front. It's that simple. Unless you do that, exactly what Nick was implying strongly. When you're trying to solve this problem when you're being litigated, boy, is that painful. That's all I gotta say. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, since you guys were talking about security and then the governance, so can you guys share what are the key elements that should be considered in a data governance framework? Anyone?
I can take a stab at this, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So the one way to think about governance is kind of a pendulum, if you will. So a couple of years ago, the pendulum was swinging towards let's go fast, let's break things, just use the data, build the model, and ship it. I think now with all the litigation that Denny is talking about, and I think all the issues with GDPR and whatnot, I think the pendulum is swinging perhaps a little bit to the other side, where I see customers wanting to review a lot more, analyze everything, mitigate risks, et cetera, et cetera. And so I would say that there is a risk that we shift too much to the, risk protection side and at some point, and that's where I think systems like catalogs can really help be kind of put together a smart governance in place, where perhaps one model is you create like a fast lane for assets that you feel comfortable about. And then you don't boil the ocean on these. And then you create more of a slow lane for certain assets that, maybe they have certain characteristics that you don't like as much. And then you can dedicate your resources on, reviewing those. And so where technology can help is really figure out upfront and be proactive on what are the assets that, you would like to see in the fast lane and what are the assets that you would like to see in the slow lane, and kind of perhaps organize governance around that. And so have systems to triage at a high level what it could look like. That's going to make things a little easier. One of the other things that I learned is, when we started in 2020 doing things to do the triage and assess things, we started by asking 35 questions about data. And we felt like, oh, we absolutely need to know these 35 things about the data. And so that was consuming a lot of time. And over time, we went down from 35 to like 8, right? And so, but making sure like you adapt your governance framework, you build that muscle and this understanding takes time. And that's going to be informed by your risk acceptance, the kind of business you're in, what your customers are asking, and so on and so forth. So start simple, try to aim for the middle, something balanced, and fast and slow. I think that's it's a good way to start.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I can weigh in on this as well. And I think Nick made amazing points, because I think that a lot of what these new governance frameworks and catalogs are all about is the access control. How can you make assets readily available and give people the green light and freedom? And then how can you have sensitive assets protected? And I think that all of the leaky stuff that you see in between is where a lot of these issues are coming from. That being said, we're at this push-pull right now, especially with governance, where the rate of innovation for generative AI is so fast that a lot of these legacy systems that were built for governance before are having to conform almost to the applications. And it's not necessarily like this gate-kept framework that is actually protecting us, but it's instead kind of like fighting, right, with this rate of innovation that we're seeing. And so we're noticing that a lot of the ways that catalogs are being framed now are trying to bridge these two worlds instead of just, enforcing one to their will, which is just not going to work, right? We've seen technology win over and over again. And so oftentimes when we think about the life cycle management of this, I think we're going to see catalogs also evolve to be able to capture things like value streams, to be able to be optimized for continuous metadata instead of just like static metadata that we've seen before, and have this also enable other generative AI applications to be able to directly interact with. And so the actual shape of what this takes form as will probably differ a lot, but ideally with that access-based control that we see, and obviously all these other useful things that metadata can provide, such as like data quality, ownership, contextualization, will shape a lot of these different things. And it will be really exciting to see in the future.
All right. Well, last question is totally optional for you. If you guys are interested in sharing your crystal ball with us, like what future trends do you foresee in the realm of AI of data in the generative AI era? And how should organizations be prepared for those changes? I know it is totally hypothetical, but if you feel like if you're compelled to share, please do share. Or you guys are very conservative, you don't want to share.
Well, I can
Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah. I think companies will have to fit. There is a ton of private data there, a ton of private stuff. And it's sitting there and nobody wants to touch it because it's like, ooh, super scary. Scary stuff. Like customers are going to sue you, they're going to run away. And so I think the next frontier is like how to, leverage that private data in a smart way.
All right. Anyone else?
I would absolutely 100% agree with Nick on this one. In fact, that's part of the reason why I hawk Uni catalog, right? Because basically that's the whole context of building in data sharing right from the get-go. And the reality is this is a good reset in terms of us asking the question of what data sets and what are we doing with it before we even get it into the model? And so I feel that the fact that the three catalog representations are here is again very, very core to exactly what what you asked now, which is like where's the future, right? The reality is people are going to understand that whether it's the three of us, whether it's something else, doesn't matter. We're not trying to hawk one thing or another with my little shading here, but the reality is people are going to actually need to care about these things. They're going to need to care about where their data sets are from. They're going to need to care about their lineage, and there's going to be better tooling for it, and there's going to be better research and techniques to highlight these things, right? Ultimately, when we started this whole journey of Gen AI, like obviously the journey's been a while, but it exploded, of course, with OpenAI and ChatGPT. But even before that particular push, right, there was already really good models, right, and a lot of it was based off of not just the research that was done, but also about the data that was used. So again, it still goes back to the same thing. What data are you using? Now, the future is while there's still going to be the various proprietary systems that are going to keep pushing the boundaries of for generalized Gen AI, which is good, really, really good. This is not me throwing shade at all. Quite the opposite. I love it. I do think from a prediction perspective, when it comes to businesses, they're going to recognize that yes, there are going to be some scenarios where using those generalized models is going to make all the sense in the world. And that there are going to be some systems where they're going to have to use much smaller models with their own private data, just like what Nick was alluding to, right? In order to be able to go ahead and get the most value out of it. Because in the end, they're still spending money. How are you going to get value out of these systems? And then ultimately, there's going to have to be tracking of what data to use and what lineage to use, which means all the procedures and policies. And again, right back to why are there three catalog companies busy talking to us here, because that's exactly the point. In a lot of ways, the three of us sitting here represents where this is going. That's why we're doing what we're doing. So,
absolutely. And anyone else?
Yeah, I can add into this as well. I think for so long, we were so concentrated on optimizing the vertical stack, and now everything's horizontal. Like, I think that we're really trying to catch the wide breadth that data has kind of come into and using it in a way that's cost effective. And I think, this is my conspiracy theory for the future, but I think all of these stakeholders and companies are so concerned with catching up to generative AI that they're not necessarily considering the data infrastructure that's that has to go into actually making this work at value. And once they're kind of realizing after these applications are built, but the data infrastructure was not necessarily invested in, that those outputs and those applications are going to cost way more to develop to get to a state that's actually providing value for them than maybe they realize. And so whoever is going to come into this space and actually allow, generative AI applications to be built with low cost data infrastructure that doesn't require overhauling, or bringing in a ton of technical debt is kind of going to be who wins. And in that same essence, that value stream of actually figuring out how much that cost is of building the data infrastructure and actually developing the generative AI applications themselves versus how much value the actual company is actually going to generate from these applications after all of that work has been done is going to be a totally different realm of tooling. I think FinOps is the perfect embodiment of this. And we're going to see so many tools kind of figuring out the cost and value around these things. And it's going to be tough for sure.
All right. Okay, with that, we are almost out of time. So thank you so much, panelists. In wrapping up, I'd like to say that while GenAI is advancing rapidly, we must never lose sight of the importance of data that underpins it. The way we approach data management, governance, and ethics will define the success of GenAI. And it is a journey that we must take together. Thank you to our panelists for your insightful contribution, and thank you all for joining us. Before we leave, I just want to do a quick plug on generative AI Commons. I try to follow like Danny. Danny does this. So we were launched last December, and it's been a phenomenon, and we have over 200 participants from over 90 companies. And our mission is to help advance the innovation of GenAI via open source and open science. And we have 4 work streams right now that covers, open source projects in the model data areas, as well as responsible AI. We also have a framework. Recently, actually a few months ago, we announced Model Openness Framework. That framework we created is to combat open washing. So there's a lot of exciting work going on at Generative AI Commons. Please join us. Go check out the website, www.genaicommons.org, and join us. We have bi-weekly calls, and every single bi-weekly call will feature a guest speaker. A month ago, we had a speaker from Stanford, MIT, talking about their transparency index. And next one, at the next meeting, we're gonna have a speaker from Alan Turing Institute and talking about ethics in GenAI. So a lot of exciting stuff going on. Please come join us. With that, thank you so much for your time, and panelists and audience, and we look forward to seeing you next quarter. Bye-bye.
Take care.